Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, where my co-hosts, Sarah Hastings-Simon, David Keith, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.substack.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly.
What you're about to listen to is the audio of a webinar on Building Alberta Back Better that we ran on September 9th, 2020. In early September, we published an op-ed in the Globe and Mail in the lead up to our returning to the air. Our guiding question was, our new federal finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, wants to build back better. As Albertans, we want to build Alberta back better. What does this mean for Alberta oil? The op-ed clearly touched a nerve, garnering more than 800 comments. On the September 9th webinar and today's podcast, we tackle some of the points we raised in the op-ed, debate some of the feedback we've received, and take viewer questions. We hope you enjoy it. And let us know what you think. You can reach us at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. That's energyvsclimate@gmail.com. Now on to the show.
Okay, so let's dive into the first question for today, and it's a simple one. Why did we write this op-ed, and why did it touch a nerve? David, over to you.
I guess I'm worried that there's an obvious, easy choice here, that the federal government wants to do something about climate, and it wants to find a way to reach out to Alberta. You know, Liberals would like to get votes in Alberta if they ever could. And the natural thing to do is to put a bunch of money into technologies and policies that will reduce oil patch emissions. And the oil patch has been talking about this forever, about how they can become greener. And so there seems like a natural fit between what many in the Alberta oil patch want and the feds want that goes in that direction. And yet I really question whether that's the right thing for Albertans, for the next generation of Albertans. I think we're going to be producing oil in this province, oil and gas, for a long, long time. But I think the idea that we can somehow transition to carbon neutral or green oil strikes me as highly unlikely. And we're better to think about the core things we have, the education, the entrepreneurial nature, the businesses here, the combination of blue and white collar workforce, and think, what can we do that produces really big value-added jobs for the future? And that might not be oil. And so my goal was to kind of push people off the default assumption, because we might not actually want to put any money, in my view, into trying to green the oil patch.
Great, and we'll unpack that further, but Sarah, what's your take on the op-ed and the nerve that it touched?
I think a lot of what I said earlier about our name kind of encompasses it. To me, another reason that it's important to talk about this now is that I do think that we've reached sort of a turning point or an inflection point in that the demand for oil, is changing somehow. We can argue when exactly it will peak. And so while, you and I have been parts of organizations that previously had said we need to think about how we reduce the environmental footprint of our oil production, I think that it's time to really change that conversation, and that we risk to kind of continue along with that message, just kind of hanging there and getting still a lot more focus than it deserves. And, I think that it really touches a nerve because it's a challenging thing, right? I mean, it's, what we're saying, of course, is as people that live in Alberta and, want to see a prosperous future here, I've made Alberta my home and I would like to stay here for a very long time. And so it's scary. Right? I mean, it's scary to me to see the challenge that we're up against. And I think it also touches a nerve because until recently, a lot of the focus has been on how we shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that, and not a lot on so what should we do instead? And so, when presented with a problem without a solution, then there's a natural reaction to that, which is, I think, a lot of what we're seeing.
Sure. Yeah, and I'd share with you, and I know, David, you're the same. Listen, we live here in Alberta and we've raised kids in Alberta, or raising kids. We've got a deep stake in this province. We're not overnight campers planning to relocate. Right now, you've got to look like the feds and provinces, they're contemplating once in a generation investments in the economy. Some of it is played out, but I really think it's still just the tip of the iceberg. What we're hearing is, especially budget 2021, the federal budget, will be a big spend budget. It will set the direction of Canada for perhaps a generation to come. And then that's it. That's it. After that, we're looking at, say, a decade of digging out of a massive fiscal hole in terms of debt. So we, I think, want to inform that debate and think it was timely to do so, to make sure we make the right investments if this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Why it touched a nerve? Well, our last guest, Peter Terzakian, I thought he put it well when he talks about the 3 stages of people were disruption, and then denial, and then transition. We're in the early stages of transition, but you still have a lot of people caught up in denial around a lot of issues. And I think they're in denial because partly they're hurting. There's an Angus Reid poll that came out just today that shows exactly that. Albertans are the most pessimistic in the country when it comes to their financial outlook. So in doing this, it's easy if people look at it and they're hurting, they've lost jobs, or career engineers and haven't worked for a while, to say, well, look at these 2 eggheads, 2 of them physicists, and one guy who was resigned from the board of the AER, they're telling us what to do. There could be a negative, very visceral reaction. So not surprised, not the first time. Okay, let's now move on to our first audience poll. One of the big areas of pushback that we received to our op-ed was saying that peak oil is near. So is peak oil near? Let's hear what you think. Global oil production will peak before 2030, before 2050, it'll peak before 2100, or already peaked. What we said in our op-ed is that peak oil is near, not because of scarcity, but because demand is slowing. And the general theme of feedback that we received from amongst those 800 comments plus others is peak oil is not imminent. Demand is going to continue to grow. Oil is going to be around for a long time to come. COVID is a blip. And you 3 are idiots to think otherwise. So let's hear from Sarah. Then let's peek at the poll results. Let's hear from David, and we'll take it from there.
So I'll start with a COVID piece, right? So, and I remember what feels like ages ago when I think I had our first webinar and we were talking a bit about the impact of COVID on long-term demand. To be clear, I don't think any of us are saying that the impact of, staying home and sitting in our houses and the demand drops that we've seen associated with that are going to be permanent, right? It's clear that, demand is trending back upwards as we start getting out and doing more. But really the question to me is, what are the structural changes that were underway already, and how might those be accelerated by the pandemic? So things like working from home, things like reduced work travel, things like the green stimulus spending that's happening, already in the EU in a major way, and we're going to see play out elsewhere. And so I think that it's those pieces really more than COVID itself, but in so much as that hits a bit of a reset button and might cause us to see some of those changes happen sooner. I think that combined with, what we were seeing already, which was partially climate motivated. So you have a lot of strong climate policies coming into play. And, just looking right now at the pictures that I've been seeing coming out of California and Oregon this morning, where they're just facing really devastating wildfires, I think that the desire to act on that is only going to increase. And at the same time, you have technology that's advancing quite quickly around batteries and EVs. And so it's this perfect storm of kind of the technology is there, the will is there. You've hit a bit of a reset where people, can look at their habits and start to change their habits. And I think all of those are going to move the peak sooner than, what it already was, what a lot of people were saying was going to be, already 2030 to really being, either now or in the very near future.
So my personal view is that transportation demand and transportation energy demand won't peak for a very long time, maybe ever. I mean, if you include space travel or, some kind of very fast travel in the future, it may be that we still have rising total energy for transportation into the next century. I could easily believe that. But I think that climate policy is not going to happen as quickly as Greens want. But there are really strong pushes for climate policy that are growing and for air pollution policy. And that combined with the fact that electric light-duty vehicles really are getting cheaper. I mean, against my expectations, cheaper and more plausible than I thought. That doesn't mean they can take the whole market quickly. They won't. For me living in Alberta, doing some long distance drives and in the winter, I'd say electrics are still quite a long way off. but that's a rare case. Most people live in urban areas, and I think there's lots of opportunity for pretty quick penetration into that urban part of light-duty vehicle demand, which is maybe a third of total transportation demand. And there are pathways, not immediate, but there are pathways further out to deal with other parts of the transportation system. So if you're talking aircraft, where I think demand just keeps going up for a very long time, or long-distance freight, there are clearly pathways that can work. Some combination of synthetic fuels and hydrogen. Neither of those are going to take big chunks of the market, I don't think, before the 2040s. But I think they're technically doable, and the policy drivers are there. And that means I expect to see total demand gradually flatten and have a long flat peak, but it will not keep going up.
Okay. David, I just want to pick up on something that you said. So you said that climate policy is strengthening, but not as fast as Greens would want. And I count myself amongst those Greens, let's say. But then where is it strengthening? Because if you look at the past couple of years, it doesn't feel like it's strengthening. So what makes you say that?
Yeah, so I mean, I would count myself on the Greens too. So I think what you're seeing is this bottom up, measured by polling, measured by action in the streets, measured by the kind of symbolic stuff like Fridays for the Future and Greta has done. You're seeing that pressure move up into the investment and policy community. So what you're not seeing much yet, and a critic would say, is much in the way of major new legal initiatives, say in the EU, US, or China. But what you are seeing is debate among elites in the U.S. Senate, even under Trump, or in China, or in EU, and polling in those countries clearly shows significantly stronger appetite for climate action. And one thing you're seeing is the investment community really beginning to respond to calls for climate action in a way that wasn't happening a few years ago, or rather, it was happening more purely symbolically, and now it's inching from symbolism into some real action.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
I would just push back, David, a little on what is happening in the legal front. I think a lot of these things are coming into effect in places, and we're only just going to start to see the teeth of them, right? So a couple examples, right? In California, there's some pretty dramatic targets that were just put in place around EVs. And one story that I really like or dislike coming out of Germany is that the 2030 target for the German car fleet is based on the 2020 emissions benchmark. And so what you actually see is a bunch of German car companies, which are, big sellers in the world, obviously, just ready and waiting when that clock hits, January 1st with their fleet of EVs. They can't get them into the market in a major way this year because they want to make sure, to cook their target a bit, make it a bit easier. But I think we're still going to be surprised. Some of us will be surprised by the pace of that change of these laws that are just starting to trickle down onto the books.
Great. Okay. I just want to look at the poll results, and then I want to talk about why this is such a sensitive topic. So on the poll result, close to 50% think it's going to peak before 2030. 17% think that it's already peaked. I'm actually surprised by how high that is. 31% see a peak before 2050, and then a scant 3% sees a peak before 2100. That seems like a long way off, but there we go. So before 2030. I would like to just unpack a little bit why this is so sensitive, and I'll give you my take, and I'd love to hear from the two of you. We recognize the world is going to add 2 billion people between now and 2050, and that's like adding a couple Detroits every week for the next 30 years. And we're also going to add, let's say, 1 billion new cars to the existing fleet of 1 billion cars. And for a long time, we thought that Alberta Oil could help to power to provide energy services to the extra 2 billion people, and could also help to power those 1 billion new cars. And I've literally had senior executives of energy companies say, our vision is Alberta Oil will light up sub-Saharan African villages. And I get that, and I want that vision as well. I just see tremendous logistical challenges, not to mention carbon and cost challenges that we're talking about today to that. But in a world, if we didn't have climate constraints, we would be providing those energy services or powering those extra billion cars through hydrocarbons. They're cheap, they're
sure.
We've got them in abundance, and of course we would do that. But we do have this climate problem, but I still think people have a tough time reconciling those realities of an extra 2 billion people, an extra billion cars, and climate realities that will start to limit the role that oil can play. And when I look at every credible 2C scenario out there right now, including some produced by the super majors, by big oil and gas companies, They have common elements around decarbonizing and increasing electricity, electrifying mobility and heat, increasing or decreasing energy intensity across sectors. And it means that oil consumption peaks and declines. But there still seems that a lot of people have difficulty computing in their minds, adding so many new people, so many new cars, and there not being this tremendous hockey stick-like growth for oil. So what do the two of you think? Why is this such a sensitive topic? It's almost like poking a sacred cow in this province.
I think there's two factors as we put it out in the op-ed. I mean, one is this gradual weakening of demand that's going to come fundamentally from climate and technology, from climate policy and technology. But the other one is tight oil becoming more global. So there being more options for oil. And we had some people push back saying we didn't know the difference between light and heavy oil, or, I helped to build refinery models. I mean, yes, we know the difference. We just didn't talk about it in a short op-ed. But I think at the large scale, when you allow for refineries to change, those things do compete in a roughly liquid market. And the fact is that while tight oil is not as easy as its proponents say, and while decline rates are high and so on, fundamentally, the world did figure out how to make much more oil at prices around $50 a barrel. And there's no reason to think that figuring out won't extend to other basins. And that means that in a world where that's true and demand is slowing down, that the forecast for long-run prices really doesn't look good. And that's the thing that I think really alters the way maybe some people ought to think about Alberta's future role.
Yeah, I guess, violently agree with David on this one. I think, some of the pushback that we got around the substitutability is really not looking at, the short term versus long term, where I think people do acknowledge that, right? Because there is often this call that Alberta oil should replace Saudi oil, which obviously is that mostly lighter oil that, we would be trying to compete with. And, it does come down to these dynamics of what is the decline rate from, the wells that are producing? How quickly do the refineries shift over? But I think one of the big challenges is really as investors that are going after new oil in this world that's increasingly volatile, shale, which you can turn on and off, very quickly, is a much more attractive investment area for new oil. And so again, it's this point of, I feel like it keeps being lost in the debate and discussion in Canada. And I don't know if that's willful in some cases, or just, we're often kind of discussing up here and not going down into the weeds. But this idea that, we can continue to produce from our existing projects in Alberta. But that's very different than asking whether or not we will be building new projects. And it's also very different talking about, what the oil price is and what that means for royalties and for, jobs and all of those things. And so, I think it's, you can debate the peak year, itself, but I think you're already seeing a number of players, major players that are saying, look, as we're thinking about where our next oil investments and oil production is going to come from, it's not going to be here, and changing the environmental footprint isn't going to change that.
I think to come back to the core idea in that op-ed, it's if you have an extra 100 million or whatever it is to spend, two worlds. One world, you spend that money to somewhat reduce the upstream environmental footprint of oil from Alberta, carbon footprint particularly. And the other world, you invest it in whatever is the next thing that's going to work in Alberta, whether it's some kind of new light manufacturing or nuclear power development. I'm not talking nuclear power for oil sands. I'm talking for low carbon electricity or wind power or IT, whatever it is. I would say that money invested to make the marginal upstream carbon emissions a little bit lower doesn't change the fundamentals. It doesn't change the fact that we're not going to have the big investment flows that drive the high value jobs here. Whereas money spent to really help transition the economy to something new, of course, there's lots of examples of wasting that money, but there's a chance it really could build something new that helps to build a vibrant economy for the future. And so that's why my view is don't spend it on trying to make the upstream oil a little bit lower carbon.
So does that mean, David, zero investment in trying to reduce emissions in upstream oil production across all sources of oil in Canada?
I would argue that there really should be near zero public investment in really trying to reduce carbon footprint of oil. It just shouldn't be our focus.
Okay.
We should,
So you said, though, off the top, we're going to continue producing oil in this province for decades. And we know that even with peak and decline, we're still going to be looking for 50 million barrels of new production per day, given decline rates. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out, and I say this and try, to get our perspective out. What is the role of Alberta Oil in a market that has peaked and is starting to decline and prices are starting to soften, but you still have these decline rates? You still have to go out and find 50 million barrels per day of new oil to replace depleting reserves.
Well, maybe the world does, but does Alberta? So Alberta is very, very heavily oil dependent economy. And maybe the answer is we need to start transitioning now. We need to start taking all those, we have a great education system, both K through 12 and university system. We have SATA and NAIT, these strong blue collar places. We need to start saying, how can we get, what jobs can those people do and develop jobs that aren't oil?
Okay. So let's just take a pause for a second, because now we're talking to the next topic we want to talk about, which is public investments in the oil and gas economy, or specifically oil. So let's go to our poll. Should we continue to invest significant public money, and for example, $100 million a year into emissions reductions technologies in the oil industry? Okay, we've heard from David. Sarah, what do you think?
So I get to unpack the 5 paragraphs I tried to put in. You guys rightly cut out of the op-ed. So I've been waiting for weeks for this. So my answer is a little bit, it depends. But the key question I would put back to that is, what is the goal of that investment? I think there's maybe 3 or 4 different reasons you might want to invest money into cutting emissions in the oil sector. So, one of them, which is the one that keeps being put forward, is to ensure that Alberta produces the last barrel and to enable us to grow oil production. And I think that is the one that clearly, that's a goal that is not worth investing public money towards, because the prize there is shrinking. There are other reasons, though, that you might want to do it, right? And some of those are valid. So one reason is just because, aside from sort of shifting our economy in Alberta to compete in a low carbon future, we also need to reduce emissions, the footprint of our own emissions at home. So that's one that I'll come back to. The other reason would be, if we think that there is some new technology that we can grow that will, produce value for the province. So those are there's sort of 3 reasons. And, we definitely shouldn't do it for the first, but I think the other 2, there may be some value to that. And then you have to kind of look and double click on each of those things, right? So when you talk about to reduce emissions, are there, we have a price on carbon. In principle, if there is a cost-efficient emissions reduction opportunity within the oil sands, then the company should pursue it, because they are leaving, $30 to $50 on the table if they don't. Now, I actually believe that there are lots of barriers to going after efficiency projects. There might be an internal rate of return that oil companies are looking for that are higher. There might be a risk to production, either real or perceived. So I do think it makes sense to use public policy instruments to address that, whether or not and probably the bluntest instrument there would just be, cash invested. So that may not be the answer. It may be, being a bit smarter about setting up loans at least, or, enabling third-party financing, some kinds of investments that can go into making these cost-efficient energy efficiency measures. If we see them as a jobs program, that might be an opportunity for the federal government or provincial government to directly employ people to do this, right? So I think it's worth kind of looking into that, but very much not in the way of handing over a bag of cash to the industry to pursue that. And then the other one, which gets a lot of attention, is this idea that when we have new technologies, we need public investment to get them going. I'm obviously a big proponent of that point of view, and I think that we have to walk a very fine line here, right? It is very true that many of the things that we are going to be good at in the future are going to be related to the skills and industries that we have today. But at the same time, there's going to be this incredible pull to develop technologies that are serving the business needs of the companies and industries that are here today. And so, how to walk that line, I do worry that lately, and you just look at the massive amounts that had gone into CCS versus sort of everything else that Alberta did on investments over the past decade. We tend to fall too close on that spending on the incumbents versus towards the future.
Correct. And just you mentioned CCS, so I'd love to get all of us to comment on CCS specific. So I actually see CCS as worthy of public investment, but it depends on the mechanism. I actually don't think we should do what we did 10, 12 years ago, which was shower a bunch of cash on specific projects, because we did that. And what did we get out of it? We got some projects. We got the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. You got the Shell Quest project. Weyburn has benefited from some public investment. But other than that, CCS progress slowed. And why CCS is important is I think all pathways to net zero in Canada passed somehow through accelerating the deployment of carbon capture technologies. But there are non-subsidy instruments that we can use. One of the things I'm particularly bullish on is a Section 45Q tax credit equivalent for Canada, which I've been part of, full disclosure, part of an initiative trying to get traction around that idea in the lead up to budget 2021. And if we were to, through that tax credit, essentially forego $1.5 billion in tax revenue over 10 years, so over 10 years, not 1 year, and we throw around billions these days like it's chump change. If we do that over 10 years, then we would have $5.5 billion in economic activity, and not just in the oil and gas sector. Yes, the oil and gas sector could use CCS in some places. I don't think in the oil sands, but in some instances to drive down emissions. But it would really work using that technology. That has been proven by oil and gas projects like Quest, and we can apply them to steel and cement, for example, and other industrial sectors. So that I see as worthy public investment. But I think part of it is they just bristled at our primary thesis, which is we're saying if you're producing high carbon, high cost oil today, in a world of low-cost oil and moving to low-carbon oil, then we see it as, and I think, Sarah, in our op-ed, you coined the phrase, a Herculean adjustment effort, and therefore it's a bad use of public funds. And I think we stand by that. And by the way, looking at our poll results, boy, have we ever split the room.
Yep, good.
Split the room. This looks like a recent presidential election result, or perhaps a Quebec referendum result. 53% say yes, we should continue to invest significant public money into emissions reductions. 47% no. Okay.
Ed,
David,
I wanted to.
comments.
Oh, go ahead.
Yep. No, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in on your question of, spending the money in the subsidies format. I actually think that if anything in Canada, we do too little direct subsidization of new technologies. We're too quick to go to tax credits and, maybe industry cost sharing. And we need to do more of that. That's my point of view, right? I think that too often, the whole idea is that government is going to push forward these ideas that are further from market. And so if we're purely relying on tax credits to make them happen, we're almost by definition not going to be there. So you do need to be careful, right? Because of course you're talking about using public money and it can be wasted. But I think that we've fallen a bit into this trap of, if we do it in this way with tax credits, it won't be a waste. Whereas if we do direct subsidies, it will. And I think that's quite a dangerous way to approach this policy.
Okay. All right. One question I want to put to the two of you, and then I want to get to our chat board here and bring in questioners. Methane specifically. Is methane and investing, because Canada has just announced recently announced a fairly big package, $675 million, for methane reduction opportunities in the oil and gas sector. Not just the oil sector, it's probably more specific to the gas sector, far more. Is that a good use of public funds or no?
I personally don't think it's good to put too much money in. People exaggerate the importance of methane for climate, partly because they take as some scientific fact the global warming potentials, the ratio of methane to CO2, and those global warming potentials are correct if you believe the world has no value whatsoever after 100 years, because they have discount to zero in 100 years. But if you care about the long-term future, if you like to preserve your grandkids and kids' chance to live in a healthy climate, then that overvalues the importance of methane. Methane has an atmospheric lifetime of just a decade. And I certainly think we should put some effort into reducing methane emissions upstream and downstream. But if you believe, as I do, that we're going to need to transition away from oil and gas, I think we should put some carbon equivalent price on methane to encourage people to do the obvious. But I don't think a big focus on figuring out how to squeeze those relatively short atmospheric lifetime methane emissions out of oil and gas makes sense compared to other ways we could spend the money to make a cleaner environment for our kids.
Sorry, I just want to hot pursuit that or quick rebuttal. So David, we need to transition away from oil and gas. Yes, we also need to produce a lot more electricity if we're going to electrify mobility and heat. That electricity, some of it will come from renewables, but there are simple limitations in terms of economics and social license to how much renewables you can produce. Some is going to come from combined cycle natural gas. For that, we still need gas, and gas is still going to be around for many decades. And if it is, then why wouldn't we should go after the methane problem, and it's a cheap ton to go after.
Well, but you mentioned CCS. So one place is, so I think I'm not supportive of a big effort to do CCS in oil production, say enhanced oil recovery, because I just don't really understand the environmental case. But I do think that there are places where CCS for electricity can make a lot of sense. And I do think that somebody's asked about renewables. We will need natural gas to manage intermittency in renewables. And natural gas with CCS could make a lot of sense. And I think it'd be great to see some projects like that go. But then you're going after the big bulk of the carbon footprint, which is the combustion emissions. And, again, it's like, why did Willie Sutton rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Most of that carbon is there. The methane emissions in the upstream pipeline system are relatively small. So I don't see a cause for Canada to put a big effort into those.
Okay. Sarah?
I guess I come down in the middle on this one in terms of, I think that it's worthwhile where it makes economic sense. And so by that, I mean, what's the equivalent carbon price that you would have to pay for this? And if I spent that money sending, the same amount of workers out to insulate a bunch of houses or improve efficiencies in other ways, how does the return of those two things calculate? I think too often we talk about, should we spend the money doing this sort of in the abstract without looking at the alternatives? I think that where it is spent, it's really important that it's structured in a way that it's going, directly to the programs that do that. And I think similarly, we are sometimes too worried about using regulations to go after some of these things, where if we say, look, they're really cheap, but we don't think pricing is going to work, we seem to often be defaulting just to spending. So, is there a role for, okay, well, if you think that we're so good at producing, these resources and we can do so cheaply, and we can address the methane problem cheaply, well, then, set people that target and they can go do it. And you know what, usually in the past, when these regulations have been set and people do retroactive analyses of, how much it costs to meet them, the actual costs are often, tens, hundreds, even thousands of the initial estimate. So I think that we also need to, take a closer look at some of that pushback around where we can't put in place regulations.
Okay, cool. So just quick thought for me, and then let's go to questions. So I think that, like coal, going after methane produces big numbers, and in this province is nearly as big as coal. I think it's a cheap ton to go after, and sometimes you're looking at sub $1 to switch out a leaky valve, and it's employment intensive. You got to find the leaks. That means jobs. You got to seal the leaks. That means jobs, and that's actually something that I think I'm bullish on that Alberta can teach the rest of the world as the rest of the world goes after its own methane emissions. But I'll give myself the last word, rightly or wrongly. Let's go to questions now. Let's give a little snapshot of the conversation we're going to have in a couple of weeks' time. See a comment here, Don Lawton. Hello, Don. One form of energy transition is to move toward blue hydrogen, natural gas feedstock, and CCS to deal with the emissions from hydrogen production. What do you think about that opportunity in Alberta? And at the risk of scooping ourselves in 2 weeks from now when we'll be talking about hydrogen, quick comments from the both of you.
Sarah first.
Sure. Hydrogen, it's like the thing on top of everybody's list these days. So I think that the one thing I'll point out is that when we talk about hydrogen, I think we're still too much talking about it just in terms of this raw fuel source. And we need to be thinking more about how, hydrogen as an example, as a change in the way that we're, using energy or producing energy is going to change many things within our global, manufacturing space, right? So, if hydrogen is going to be a major component of making low carbon steel, what does that mean? Is that hydrogen, need to be made close to steel production? Is steel production going to move to places where we can find low cost, low carbon hydrogen? Steel is cited in a place where it was because of access to the raw materials it needs today. So I think these are the kind of questions, definitely Alberta has an opportunity there, but it's more than just the hydrogen in itself. It's thinking about the broader system that sits around that.
Yeah, I think there is some real room for Alberta to develop hydrogen use technologies. So like rail cars or heavy trucking on hydrogen. I think there's some, hope that if you gave the right signals, you could develop competitive industries that could export those technologies, not the hydrogen, outside. I'm kind of skeptical that there's a real opening for Alberta to do large scale hydrogen production and export, because I don't see how that's really going to be very competitive for low carbon hydrogen. And partly that's because I don't think in the long run we're going to make what people now call blue. I don't really understand these colors, but we're not going to make low carbon hydrogen, I think, from natural gas at large scale for that long. I just did an effort with a bunch of guys from MIT looking at solar hydrogen. And I think that not today, but really in something like a decade, things are really changing. So you can now buy large scale electrolysis systems at under $500 a kWh. In fact, I was talking to a big investor who's doing a few $1 billion of project finance, and they're getting quotes that are more like 300. And you can do solar farms at under 500 as well. You put those numbers together and you start to make hydrogen, which according to this analysis we just did with the MIT Energy Group, you can start to beat CCS hydrogen in a decade. And after that, it just keeps getting better. So I think that the idea they're going to do really large scale natural gas CCS hydrogen, I don't really see. I see that as a stepping stone to develop the use technologies, which you can hope there be an export case for.
Yeah, it's interesting, David. I recently saw an article that came through in Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and it said, hey, everyone, hydrogen is going to be cost competitive with fossil fuels by 2040. I'm like, that's great. Dilithium crystals will be cost competitive with fossil fuels by 2040. That's not a bold claim. But I think, so green hydrogen, I don't know in Canada. And I'm seeing projects coming out in the Middle East where you have optimal solar resources, maybe. In Canada, I'm not sure.
No, I don't think it happens in Canada. Agree.
Okay. Yeah, great. But blue hydrogen, I think we've got some of the cheapest blue hydrogen that's on the face of the earth, stemming from the industrial heartland, northeast of Edmonton. Couple challenges there. One is, and we got to get away from the colors, by the way. Gray, black, blue, green. I think we just need to, and apparently the feds will do this, they'll just talk about carbon intensity. But the problem with hydrogen is if you try to sell it outside of this province, like it is a sexy fuel source right now, people look at it and say, oh, blue hydrogen, you need carbon capture? Oh, well, that was a failure to launch. So you're selling me on carbon capture while you're also selling me on hydrogen fuel cells. I remember the Ballard days from 2005, and gee, that didn't take off the way you'd sold it to me before. So I'm excited by it, but there is a tremendous amount of skepticism outside of our very technology geeky wonkish circles, I think, when it comes to hydrogen.
And inside too, to be clear.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I can't quite wrap my head around is why we think it has to be the fuel itself as where the value will sit, right? I feel like we're coming at this very much with these blinders on of, okay, oil has been the thing that's been where the value has been within the transportation value chain. And now we're sort of looking at hydrogen as like, well, it looks a little bit similar to oil in a number of ways. So therefore that's where the value in, the future transportation or whatever it is, value chain is going. And I think that's missing that bigger picture of, the oil was valuable not because of its, because of its physical qualities, but the price was determined by, the supply and demand. And so to your point, David, if we think there is a world with, a lot of supply and we're able to then keep just driving those costs down, then I think we need to be really careful in looking at Alberta's future with these narrow blinders of it has to look like the past, which is not to say that there might not be, resources that are valuable, but I just think that, we always need to check ourselves when we're sort of falling down into that pathway of thinking.
Hydrogen's a bad fuel in lots of ways. It has a low heating value, hard to compress, long distance transport's relatively energy and capital expensive. So I think you really got to think about where is this world where we're exporting massive amounts? I think the issue is to think about technologies and products. So can Canada export more products like primary metals or whatever that are made with a lower carbon footprint in a world where that matters? Yeah, I think that's possible. Or can we develop technologies like hydrogen-driven freight trains or heavy freight that we've developed here through local incentives, where then we get companies that are the technology companies that can sell globally? I think there's a case for that. but not in my mind such a case for this kind of large scale export. The idea that we transition our natural gas and our oil sands resources to making hydrogen, I think that's a less likely than dilithium crystals.
Fair enough. Okay, we couldn't figure out the technological issue with Lisa, so we're going to read out her question. Apologies to Lisa. Renewables need time to develop, and we will inflict incredible hardship by not allowing market forces to govern how fast we switch energy sources. The examples of California grid instability show that we are not there yet. Why wouldn't we let the market play out in its own time?
Well, I love this. I mean, so first of all, of course, it's right that renewables aren't as easy as the advocates say, and that there are issues of grid stability and batteries aren't ready for prime time. Yes. But the idea that we should just let markets play out is equivalent to saying you just are valuing the climate risk at zero. And it's important to say that in none of the large technologies, we just let markets play out. So think of big environmental problems humans have really solved, from sewage in streets to air and water pollution. Those are things where we made enormous progress throughout not just the rich world, but now much of the poor world. In none of those cases did we just let markets play out. Government regulation played a central role. And I think there's no reason to believe that somehow without regulation, markets will magically find a way to decarbonize. I've never seen a coherent argument why that's true. And so unless you simply don't believe there's a climate problem, letting markets play out cannot be the right answer. Sorry for the double negative. You need to put a penalty on using the atmosphere as a waste dump for carbon if you want to deal with the risks of building up carbon in the atmosphere.
And I'd go beyond that. So, I mean, first of all, the California story, I think we, as a new energy podcast, we are required to address this question. I think all energy podcasts have. The issue in California is not one where the problem was that there were renewables that went away, right? This is a question of how much capacity there is. That it was a very hot day. There was gas capacity that was lost. So the idea that this is the result of, or this is what happens when you have a grid with a high penetration of renewables is a simplification of what happened there. But I would just add, I guess, to what David is saying, in that this idea that we have these perfect markets is really a fallacy, right? And so the idea that if what government did was, do nothing and let things compete directly as they do today, that would be the even playing field, is really not where we're sitting, right? In terms of all kinds of, the existence of a bunch of infrastructure for one solution versus another, or the preferences of a set of investors who know more about a set of technologies versus another as well, too. So I think we have to be careful when, what we mean about letting markets play out. And just acknowledge that there isn't really, markets exist as a construct as they're constructed by governments.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry, at the risk of a pile on, Lisa, apologies in advance. But you raise a good point about California. As Sarah says, in Alberta, and I work to help to deploy renewables technology, specifically solar. In Alberta, we do have to pay attention to what's called the duck curve, is when you get too much solar on the grid at once, what it means for grid stability, but also importantly, what it means for prices. And that duck curve kicks in pretty quickly here in Alberta. So we absolutely need to be cognizant of that. Not much to add on the markets or letting market forces play out. What we can do is, and as governments are doing, use market-based instruments, public policy instruments, to give real incentives to producers and consumers of fuel to reduce their emissions. And we can find, if you look at the Clean Fuel Standard, we could spend an entire show on it. It's a low carbon fuel standard along the lines of BC and California. It does that. And if you look at what California has done now 10 years in, it's successfully coupled emissions reductions with industrial development policy. When I was in Ottawa, saw a California Area Resources Board bureaucrat give a presentation about the mechanisms of it. At the end, he had 2 slides of logos that came out of California's LCFS of new companies and new technologies that are now selling technologies around the world. So I think we can use those market-based instruments to both reduce emissions, carbon intensity, and do industrial development as well. So that was longer than I wanted it to.
Let's get a live question.
So welcome, Aaron.
I think I'm successfully unmuted.
You
Yes. Yes,
I'm
you are.
sorry to take us away from the industrial policy questions, which are my real love, but at the base of it, the questions about the future demand for Alberta's oil inform those questions anyway. So going back to the questions of peak demand, we discussed the competition for oil in evolving technologies like electric vehicles and their dissemination. Sarah discussed the long-term structural changes that might come about as a result of the pandemic in terms of workplace tendencies and air travel. But we didn't discuss demand for plastic, which, if you look at the projections by IEA and by scenarios like BP, the demand for plastic, the growth in the demand for plastic, driven by population growth and affluence growth in China, India, other emerging economies, is the one thing that's keeping growth of oil demand alive out to 2040. So that, for me, is a really live question. Although the other ones are very interesting and salient, we need to talk about plastics as well if we really want to understand the future of demand for Canadian oil.
Good question. Aaron, Sarah, David, who wants to tackle it first?
I can jump in. So, I mean, I definitely agree. I think plastic has been sort of the great answer to decline in demand for transportation fuels. But I think that you're going to see a very similar story play out there, where you have the pressures to, deal with plastic pollution coming from many countries that have, put in place bans on single-use plastic bags, and others coming to force with the technology for replacements and also improved recycling and circularity. And so when you have, somebody like a Unilever taking big steps to talk about reducing their use of virgin plastic, I think these forecasts with demand growth are kind of ambitious, let's say. Although you have seen, I think it was earlier this week or last week, there was an interesting and a little scary story coming out of the US around the kind of some trade negotiations that were kind of clearly tied to trying to increase the demand for plastic, basically. So I think that, certainly there's going to be a fight over this. And you saw that, some folks were using, especially at the beginning of this pandemic when there was more uncertainty around the safety of reusable goods to kind of push this idea that we need more of these single-use plastics. But I think they're meeting some pretty strong resistance.
Maybe just one word to say that also this is where oil versus natural gas liquid starts to matter. So the plastics chemical production really drives more off the natural gas market than the oil market.
Great.
Next question.
Yeah. Let's just move on. So, what do you want to see us? This is put your money where your mouth is. Panelists, what do you want to see us put Alberta's public money into? If we don't want to invest in upstream oil and gas emissions reductions or oil, then what should we be investing public money into? and we allude to that in the op-ed. We allude to that. We sort of threw out some sector names, but we also in the op-ed recognize that the three of us, still don't know what the exact path forward is. Although at the basic premise level, we say, listen, if a public investment dollar is becoming increasingly scarce, we know what we don't want it to go into, and especially in an industry that has big market fundamentals going against it. But what should you, if you were finance minister today, what would you be investing in?
So this is a kind of dodging the answer. So first of all, what it's not. I don't think we're going to drive Alberta to be as economically vibrant as it is now just on IT services and tourism. I think we need some real industry. And I think, generically it might be light manufacturing, but I think we need to think about the skills we have. The skills that the big oil companies have here to do big, complicated project engineering and execution are skills that are in demand around the world for different kinds of projects. It's very expensive to hire engineers and big project operations in California now. There's lots of startups there where we may be a lower cost operator. That's not something maybe we aspire to, but it could produce a lot of high value jobs. I think the biggest thing at the level of the Alberta government need to do is admit we don't know the answer for sure, but have a serious bottom-up competition defined answers where we reward a limited number of winners. We don't want to make the Canadian mistake of trying to spread the money to everybody, but we don't want to say the government now knows exactly the right answer.
Yep. But so we split just follow up on that, David. We split the room down the middle in terms of should we be investing public money into oil versus not. You'll also split, and I've done this many times, a room down the middle as to is it the role of governments to pick winners or not? So can you explain, because you'll guarantee you've got half the people on the webinar who will disagree with you saying we should be picking winners.
I think that is overstated. I think that what we need is the government to do a better job picking winners, to find ways to reduce crony capitalism, to innovate, to find new ways the government can make those decisions. But I think historically in the development of all sorts of technologies that we see around us, government has played a central role in picking winners. And I think that especially in a small country like Canada, or a small province like Alberta, it's vital that you choose some champions. Otherwise, the kind of global big companies will just eat your lunch. So I do think we need to pick them. I think the key thing is innovating about how to do it in a way that doesn't fall into the obvious trap, which is throwing good money after bad when some incumbent that has political pull keeps sucking at the government tit without actually having any chance of producing high value jobs. But the world is populated with technologies like the laptop I'm talking on that came from government picking winners.
Yep. Okay. Sarah,
I'll go quickly. How about
but
that?
you've written about rare earth metals. You published a piece in the Globe. So, what do you think we should invest in? And is rare earth metals one of them?
Yeah, I won't dodge the question like David. I'll put some ideas. So I do think some of the natural resources, the metals and minerals of the energy transition writ large, so, rare earths, lithium, others, where even the technologies that we've developed or are developing for extraction of the oil sands, could be applied there because, while we are not going to need a lot of new net zero oil, we are going to need a lot of net zero materials for this low carbon future. So I think that's a huge opportunity for Alberta. And I see a lot of parallels with the way that, the government basically created SAGD and the oil sands the last time we were facing a resource crisis. I would add in there, though, in addition, I think agriculture and technology around agriculture is a big opportunity based on our, current skills and what we have in the province. And then in general, kind of engineering questions around enabling circularity in the economy. So, that's all kinds of things, but really gets at this, how are we going to make better use of resources once they enter into and are part of products and to recycle them that has some good engineering questions underneath them. And then, this question of, so how do you do it well? And there was another question, I think, around the track record, the poor track record that government has had before. I think it's walking that very fine line of using the sort of skills and resources that come from our existing industries. But where governments have had that poor track record, it's often because they've gone too close to what industry is looking for. It's not a big enough step away to really generate something new. And not to harp on that point, but actually I think that requiring matching funds from industry, it can be good for later scale deployment, but for that early stage stuff, it sort of naturally leads you down that path because who's going to have the money to put in? Well, it's the people that are, thinking about, their business today. And this is not a, attack on anybody. I mean, this is what these companies are, what they have to do for their shareholders. They are doing the right thing. But I think that's one practical way for government to try to do that picking, better.
Yep. And so I'll mention three quick ones, and then we've really got to wrap up. So one, I've said it before, I think we should publicly invest in carbon capture. It benefits a bunch of sectors, including cement and steel, and that can be through a tax credit. Two, I think we should invest in hydrogen and take advantage of some of the cheapest blue hydrogen we have on the planet, get it into our heating systems, use it. You can go up to 20% hydrogen, natural gas lines, and for transportation. Three, and we concluded our op-ed, I think we need to think about transition. And we need to think about what do we do with, unfortunately, a bunch of people in our oil and gas industries who are going to be demobilized in the next 10 to 20 years. And a basic income supplement, converting the CERB into a basic income supplement is one of those ideas. Okay, we are going to be talking more about hydrogen. So if you enjoyed our teasers today, tune in for that. Give us feedback again at energyvsclimate@gmail.com. and a shout out to the Energy News Network for sharing the blurb about our webinar in its newsletter. They publish 5 free daily newsletters, and they're available at energynews.us. Thanks. We had a lot of fun. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.substack.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.